Objection!
Welcome back to the Voice Actor's Copybook. Video games and voice acting have always had a bit of a sordid history together. Sure, when they work, they're made even better by the other, but when they fail,
this is the final battle!
Boy, do they ever fail. Way back in the 1980s, though, this little will-they, won't-they relationship wasn't even a possibility. Consoles at the time had to compete with arcade cabinets however they could, and that meant accessibility. Consoles didn't cost $1,000, and they weren't the size of the average refrigerator, but it came at a price. Hardware. Arcade cabinets were beefier in every technical aspect, boasting dozens more colors and sprites on screen at once, and even including some voice samples. Consoles couldn't keep up, and despite overtaking arcade cabinets as the dominant source of where people went to play video games, they still couldn't manage some of the more difficult technical feats, like voice acting. But characters still needed voices, an approximation of them at least. Games had stories now, and just watching text slowly scroll across a screen was boring and lifeless. Developers needed a way to represent speech without having access to the tools that would let them put spoken words in their games, and the search for a fix was over fast. Voiceless voice acting. I realize how that sounds, so let me elaborate. Voiceless voice acting basically just refers to anything that attempts to approximate speech through the use of sound effects. Speech synthesizers don't count. We're referring specifically to that trend that started during the NES era, where characters spoke in all sorts of different sounds. You'll hear this a lot in those retro throwback games like Stardew Valley and Shovel Knight. There are a lot of games with voiceless voice acting, probably more than there are games with proper voice acting, which means there are way too many examples for one person to ever go through them all. But some voiceless voice acting stands out from the rest. Strange as it may sound to prefer one set of bleeps and bloops to the next, there's a good way and a bad way to go about everything. And one of the strongest examples of good voiceless voice acting comes from none other than Phoenix Wright. Phoenix Wright was originally a Game Boy Advance game that was popularized in the West once it made its move to the Nintendo DS. The game showcases the titular Phoenix Wright, a defense attorney living in a hybrid city of San Francisco and Tokyo that has to find evidence, point out contradictions, and ultimately defend his clients. I first played it when I was just a kid, and it was so engaging that I decided then and there that I was going to grow up to be a lawyer. Once I'd come to my senses and realized what a terrible idea that was, I still had a ton of love for the game. It's compelling, it's well written, and for today's discussion, features lovingly crafted voiceless voice acting that rivals most of what's come out before or since. In order to examine what makes the voiceless voice acting in Phoenix Wright stand out, we need to break it down into three basic elements. These are typical of what you'd find in regular speech too, just abstracted in the form of sound effects. These three factors form what I'd like to coin as the PTT Trinity: pitch, timing, and timbre. Let's go through these one by one. Pitch is fairly obvious. It basically just determines how high or how low a specific sound is. High-pitched sounds are usually characterized as light and airy and feminine, while lower-pitched sounds tend to be characterized as deep and booming and masculine. Obviously, these don't apply everywhere. There are plenty of men with high-pitched voices and plenty of women with low-pitched voices and plenty of people between and outside of that binary with a whole bunch of different voices, but we're talking in some fairly broad strokes here. Phoenix Wright actually features this dichotomy in its voice acting. Male characters usually use this sound effect, and female characters usually use this one. Right away, you have contrasting pitches relegated to each of the respective genders featured in-game, and it distinguishes half of the cast from the other before we've even considered any other factors. This is actually played with in regards to certain characters as well. Wendy Oldbag, who, as her name suggests, is an elderly woman who guards the gate at a filming studio, uses the quote-unquote male voice when she speaks. While this obviously means that she's intended to have a deep voice, some people have interpreted this as meaning that she's a heavy smoker and thus speaks in a low rasp. Whether or not this was actually what the developers intended, this is a bit of extra characterization that stems purely from the choice to change the pitch of her voice. That's definitely beyond what you might expect from something that isn't even proper speech. The next one is timing, and this is pretty simple to explain too. Timing is the difference between a sentence that sounds like this and one that sounds like this. Having your characters spew their lines in one long chain of monotonous sound effects has been pretty commonplace for a while, but Phoenix Wright does something different. When characters speak, they take appropriate pauses. This tends to be done with magic numbers in the game's code, which basically means that every single line has to be written, tweaked for timing, played back to verify that both the speaking speed and pauses sound right, and then adjusted until they're perfect. Is it efficient? Definitely not. But what it means is that each line is handcrafted to sound as natural as possible, usually within hundredths of a second. If you ever get the chance, try reading a line from one of the games, just written down on a piece of paper, and then see how your timing matches up with the character in the game who says it. For the most part, you'll tend to come pretty close to syncing up. It speaks to how much effort went into making the dialogue sound like it's coming from actual people when the timing can be so easily replicated by, well, actual people. Last but not least is timbre, and this is where things get a little confusing. Timbre, in terms of vocals, is what distinguishes one voice from another. I realize that sounds more than a little redundant given the last 2 points, but timbre tends to be a catch-all term that refers to the immeasurables. The little details and inflections and quirks that make every voice unique and identifiable. But like we said earlier, character voices in this game just consist of the same default sound, just pitched up or down depending on who's speaking. How do we get any nuance out of that? After all, if you were to just listen to them back to back, wouldn't all of the voices be entirely identical? Where does timbre come into play? Well, keep in mind that we also defined voiceless voice acting as sound effects trying to approximate speech. And just as every person's voice has their own depth and tonal color, every character in this game has sound effects and themes that are exclusive to them. Godot chugs his coffee. Damon Gant applauds. Phoenix himself has themes that explode into the mix once he points out a contradiction. Sure, bringing music into the equation might seem like cheating, but all of these things establish timbre. They're the little breadcrumbs that lead you to project your perceptions of these characters onto their non-existent voices. You start giving them their own timbre in your head as you play, and it builds and becomes more complex the more time you spend with them. It gets to a point where you can tell what's going on in the story even with your eyes closed. You can't read what's being said, but when you hear that iconic desk slam, the trickle of sentences slowly unfolding, and then that explosion of triumphant music, you know exactly what's going on. And that's what makes the voiceless voice acting here so impressive. Phoenix Wright manages to tell a story using nothing but sound, just like you would with a real human voice. Of course, I imagine that answer isn't going to satisfy everyone, so I'll take an aside to talk about a more traditional example of timbre. Undertale. I know, okay? Everyone's done Undertale, I get it. But I'm not gonna spout off some stupid game theories here, okay? Like, I don't know, Sans' voice just being sampled off Patrick from SpongeBob. Oh my god! In all seriousness, Undertale is undoubtedly a more fitting example of traditional timbre than Phoenix Wright. Every character speaks in their own sound font that mirrors their personalities pretty well. Toriel sounds calm and maternal. Papyrus sounds loud and energetic. And yeah, Sans sounds goofy and laid back. Because he's Patrick. Undertale has all of the elements of voiceless voice acting as well. Pitch, timing, and timbre are all present, and arguably to a better degree. So why didn't I just make this video about Undertale instead? Well, on top of not wanting to add another Undertale analysis video to the massive YouTube pile, it's about time. Undertale came out in 2015. Phoenix Wright came out in 2001 on a system about as powerful as a Super Nintendo. 18 years ago, using hardware that was already starting to show its age, the developers of Phoenix Wright laid the groundwork for voiceless voice acting in video games. Obviously, it wouldn't be very smart of me to encourage more developers to eschew proper voice acting for voiceless voice acting. But if your budget only allows you to go for the voiceless option, then try to keep the PTT Trinity in mind. And that goes for voice actors too. Pitch, timing, and timbre are core elements that, if you can figure out how to best use them to amplify your natural voice or alter them in the pursuit of expanding your range, are going to be a boon for all of your creative endeavors. Someone who understands what makes a person sound like a person is invaluable, be they a developer or an actor. And I don't think that's something anyone will object to.
Objection!
Except for him. Hi there, thanks for checking out episode 3 of the Voice Actors Copybook. This has been a bit too long in the making. I apologize for the delay. I know I've already explained myself and apologized 100 times before, but I feel it bears repeating. Hopefully further entries in the series won't have this far of a gap between them. In any case, thanks again for watching, and I hope it was worth the wait. Here's what we're going to be tackling next time. Let's just hope we don't suffer like G did.